If God is all powerful and all loving, why does He allow horrible things to happen to such good people?
Maybe you came out last Sunday night and saw the movie Acts of God. If you did, I think you'll agree with me that it was absolutely a powerful movie, wasn't it? I mean, it was powerful. I was crying. There were times when I was crying. And if you, for some reason, didn't get to see that movie, if you let me know, I'll let you borrow it, because it is that powerful, especially if you're going through a hard time. If there's some things going on in your life, or have been, or you know someone who's going through a hard time, then I'll let you borrow the movie and you can watch it on your own in your home. And I promise you'll find comfort and wisdom and strength from it. That's how good it is. Acts of God. This is the last Sunday in this series. It's a series about things that happen to us that we can't control. Things that happen that we have no power over, and a lot of those things are bad things. They're suffering things. They're tragic things. And some things that happen to us aren't tragic, but we just can't do anything about it, and it's just, we feel helpless in some cases. And this series is called Acts of God because, it's based typically on this idea that when you're dealing with your insurance company and something like that happens, if it's a natural disaster, they call it an act of God. And so what we've been looking at really after that initial sermon is the life of Joseph, and how Joseph went through some pretty hard times. I mean, he really suffered unjustly by his brothers, by Mrs. Potiphar, by the baker, or the butler rather, that didn't remember him. He suffered, but through it all, he remained faithful to God. And that's the question for us today, living in 21st century America. Are you fully trusting in God? And I've told people before, America has a problem. The American church has a problem because we are so wealthy and so independent that we have this notion that we don't really need God. We don't really need Him until there's a crisis in our life. And then we kind of use Him like a 911 emergency call. And we hope He'll come through for us and deliver us so we can give Him praise and then go back to living our life the way we were doing. So we got to change that, folks. We got to change that. We have to learn to trust Him in every part of life, when things are good and when things are bad, and really live a life dependent upon Him. Well, generally, the students who went to college this past semester, this semester here, were born in about 1996. You know some of them. You're related to some of them. About 1996. And every year, Below College publishes its annual mindset list to give to its professors, so that the professors will understand the world that these entering college freshmen grew up in. And it's kind of interesting, this world that they've grown up in. Kids who were born in 1996, who are entering college this year, they were inundated when they were in kindergarten with images of planes flying into the Twin Towers. Can you believe that? To these kids, a selfie with a famous person is more important to them than an autograph. To these kids, Ralph Nader has always been running for president every year. Their quarter collection has always included the celebration of individual states. Not one of these kids ever had to use Netscape as their web browser. Anybody remember Netscape? Yeah. To these entering freshmen, there have always been female referees in the NBA. There have always been women in the NBA who could dunk a basketball. No Joe Camel ever introduced any of them to smoking cigarettes. And we talked about the internet. None of them can even remember what life was like before the internet. And we could go on with this list. These are some things that these professors had to learn about these incoming freshmen. Yesterday, our little foster daughter, 13 years old, was on the telephone trying to call her brother, and she had dialed the number, and she was on the phone forever. I mean, it's like, I asked her, I said, is it ringing? She said, no. She said, what does it mean when you get this constant beep, 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 beep sound? How many of you know what that is? How many of you don't have a clue what that is? You don't hear that very often anymore, do you? You don't call people and get a busy signal. That's what that is. I mean, who has a phone like that? So, does this make you feel old? Are you starting to feel old? You know, everybody wants to go to heaven, and everybody, wants to have grandchildren, but nobody really wants to get old, do they? To these kids, everybody has always loved Raymond. That's still running. Seinfeld. Well, we're going to talk about trusting God when aging today. This is kind of the wrap-up because these are the closing chapters of Joseph's life. I told you early on that this story of Joseph, really encompasses a large part of the book of Genesis. This narrative of his life really includes more than a lot of other people. I mean, maybe David, King David, and one or two others got more Bible press time than Joseph. But yet we don't talk a whole lot about Joseph, at least not as much as we do about David. But this guy is an incredible study for us, especially if you're a young person, because a lot of what happened to him when he was young, from the age of 17, to the age of 30. And he really maintained a steady faithfulness and trust in a God that he really didn't know that well. The Ten Commandments were, 400 years in the future. He didn't have a written tradition like the people did after Moses, when Moses wrote the book of Genesis and other books. He had only the stories of his father Jacob, his grandfather Isaac, and his great-grandfather Abraham. Well, the story had only really started with Abraham, this calling of these people to become God's people. So this is an incredible study. You should read through this sometime. The last part of 15 chapters of Genesis, and you'll, I know, get some blessing out of it. But we're going to talk about aging today because we're going to see Joseph get older, and we're also going to see his dad, Jacob, get older and die. And nobody really wants to get older and die, do they? I mean, we don't. I keep waiting to, I talk to my wife sometimes about, not being able to do the things physically that I like to do. And I keep waiting for that morning when I'll wake up and be able to do those again. But I'm afraid they're not going to happen. You know what I'm saying? Can anybody relate to me there? One or two of you? Yeah. And we pay big money, so that we don't have to age. And so that we can prolong our death. This country spends billions of dollars every year in beauty products and age-defying products and medical inventions and things so that we don't have to die when the rest of the world is dying. You know, the average age in Haiti? The average age in Haiti is probably down in the 50s. I just studied this for next week's sermon. 70% of the population in Haiti is under 30 years old. 70%. And so America is one of the few countries in the world that can really defy the aging and death process. The Bible says, be faithful until death. Don't be afraid. I like this passage. And I'm not sure it was applying really to getting older as much as it was applying to, as you get older in this day and age, you're going to be suffering for the name of Christ. And this verse, though, if you could apply it to, as you get older, you're going to suffer in some ways that are obvious and some ways that aren't. But take this to heart. Do not be afraid of what you're about to suffer. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you as your victor's crown. Give you life, and sometimes the crown of life. So, we are all getting older, aren't we? I remember when I first came here, I was 30 years old. My oldest two girls had been born. They were 4 years old and 3 years old. And we just were nervous and excited both to be here. And gosh, time flies, doesn't it? Time flies. It really flies. I'm nearing the end of my military career. I mean, in the next 5 years or so. And I was talking to Dave Edens on Wednesday about that, and it's like, wow, I never really thought there would come a time when I could say I'm going to retire. And again, I'm about 5 years out, and 5 or 6 years out. I never thought there would come a time when I would talk about retirement, but it happens, doesn't it? Whether we want it to or not, it just comes and happens. Greg Laurie wrote some interesting, humorous things about getting older. He said, well, you know you're getting older when you sink your teeth into a big old steak and they stay there, or you turn the lights off, not for romantic reasons, but for economic reasons. You turn the lights down low. He talks about all these things that happen to us as we get older. I heard Linus told Charlie Brown that he thought he was getting older. And Charlie Brown said, why? And he said, because I don't have any teeth and I just wet my pants or something like that. My grandmother used to say when your slip was showing, ladies, what would she say? Some of you remember this. What was happening? When your slip was showing, how many of you ladies remember what a slip is? A slip, when your slip was showing, she would say, it's snowing down south. Snowing down south. So, hey, it's snowing down south, so she pulled her slip up. And when one grandma told her granddaughter, when her granddaughter said, Grandma, it's snowing down south, she said, honey, I'm just glad it's not raining. I know where most of the older folks are sitting now. They understand what we're talking about here. Well, one person that really has aged gracefully is a national figure, really maybe an international figure. His name is Billy Graham. What a tremendous man of God. He, he's lived his whole life in the public eye practically, and he's withstood the test of time and the test of poking and prodding to see if they could find anything on him. He wrote this book called Nearing Home. Life, faith, and finishing well. And he said, all my life I was taught how to die as a Christian, but no one ever taught me how to live the years before I die. There's some other great things in that book, and that's really what we're talking about today is what do we do when we get older and we hurt and maybe life hasn't turned out the way we thought it was going to. Or maybe it did turn out the way we thought it was going to, but it left us unfulfilled or a little bit empty. So we remember this passage in Proverbs 29, the glory of young men is their strength, and a gray hair, the splendor of the old. And so, but we try to keep it from graying, don't we? But the Bible says that's a good thing. It's a sign of wisdom. I heard about a woman one time, she was in a seniors group in her church, and she was always making funny remarks, and somebody said, Madge, you're beautiful. You're just so beautiful. And she said, well, I ought to be. I'm 85 years old. And that's really the way it ought to be. Beauty is not just on the outside, it's what's happening on the inside. And as we get older, we should become more beautiful. Some of our seniors took us to lunch on Wednesday, and we appreciate it. A lot of you went, and a lot of us, our staff went, and some of you couldn't go, but we had a great time, and we kind of did a survey. Steve Harley led this, and we asked them, what can we do? What advice would you give? And these are from our seniors, these quotes. What advice would you give to help us age gracefully? And here's what they said. They said to stay active. Do it with humor. I like that. Be able to laugh at yourself. Surround yourself with friends and laughter. Be positive. Have something to look forward to. Have peace in your heart through Jesus. Do things with friends your age. And somebody said pay for your preacher's lunch every week. I don't know which one that was, but I know some of you are maybe aging pretty well. That's a good one right there. I think that'll keep you young. Well, we're looking at the life of Joseph, and as we look at the Bible, there were a lot of people in the Bible that didn't really age well. They really made some boo-boos in their later years. You look at Moses. Remember Moses? He was in his last stretch of 40 years. He lived 40 years in the palace of Egypt. This was after Joseph. He lived 40 years in the wilderness, and then 40 years of leading the people. In his last stretch, He became angry. He was angry at the people. He was frustrated with God. He struck the rock instead of speaking to it. And it ended up costing him entrance into the promised land. Look at David. You know, we studied his life not too long ago. The Bible tells us when he got older and it was the normal time for kings to go off to war, he stood on his balcony and lusted after this young woman. And, you know, his family was a wreck from then on. It didn't end so well. Solomon, the wisest man in his youth, he says, God, all I want is wisdom. All I want is wisdom to lead your people. But as he got older, he began to give in to his wives and their religions and their gods. And before you know it, the kingdom crumbled and divided under him. And we could go on down the list, you know. Samson, so many of the people in the Bible didn't finish well. And it's really a sad statement that there are a lot of people today who don't finish well. They just don't finish strong. They get bitter, or they get grumpy, or they get whiny, or you know, something happens in their life that they're just not happy as they get older. Maybe it's because they feel like we're losing something. We're not able to do what we used to be able to do. We're not able to you know, enjoy what we once could enjoy. And instead of, you know, accepting these things that are happening to us and aging with grace, we're aging with something else. But Joseph had an amazing spirit. Whether you're young or old, this story is an incredible story. Bible says in Genesis 46, now Jacob sent Judah ahead of him to Joseph to get directions to Goshen. When they arrived in the region of Goshen, Joseph had his chariot made ready and went to Goshen to meet his father Israel. That's Jacob. As soon as Joseph appeared before him, he threw his arms around his father and wept for a long time. Israel, or Jacob, said to Joseph, now I'm ready to die, since I have seen for myself that you are still alive. Now, I've alluded to the fact that this ought to be made into a movie. You know, this should be a movie. And it would be a great, great movie. And maybe the most climactic part of the movie would be when Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers. After all these years, after they betrayed him and sold him into slavery, that would be the climax. And we have the benefit of knowing the end of the story. But if we didn't know the story, we would expect, like last week, Joseph to really hammer it into his brothers because of what they did to him. But he didn't. He offered them forgiveness. We saw that last week. When you're wronged, you trust God and you forgive. Joseph saw the bigger picture and said, this is what God is doing. You didn't do this. You thought you did this, but God is in charge. This is what God is doing. But here we're going to look at what happens now to Jacob. Now Jacob, I don't think, really had a great ending. You know, Jacob was a deceiver from when he was a young boy, when he deceived his father to get the birthright over Esau. You remember that story? He was known as the deceiver. And if you'll study this passage, if you study Jacob's life, father of Joseph, you'll see that there were several times when Jacob made a comment. He said, oh, I'm going to die. I've had a hard life. You know, he told Pharaoh, he said, oh, I've had a hard life. It's been harder than my ancestors. I'm an old man. And so, maybe we can go out on a limb here and say Jacob was a little bit grumpy and whiny as he got older. But he lived another 17 years. And this part of the story is kind of the anticlimactic part of the story. It's kind of the part of the story that would just kind of be the last 5 minutes of the movie. But there's this great embrace of Joseph and his father after all these years. His father thought he was dead. This emotional time when this man is hugging his father. And I love you, Dad. I've missed you, Dad. Son, I love you. I missed you. What an emotional time for us as men if our fathers are still living, or perhaps your parents are now gone, to remember that last embrace or that last emotional moment with your parents. Boy, we never know when that's going to be, do we? And we really need to take advantage of the opportunity to love our parents, or if you're a grandparent, your children, your grandchildren. It's funny, the stages of life. You know that you're getting older when you start talking about your parents like they're your children. You know what I mean? You start talking about your parents like they're your children, and inevitably it's going to happen, and you're like, oh, I'm getting older. because my parents are getting to that point. So listen to these ways that Joseph impressed us as he cared for his father, even though I'm going to say his father got a little bit grumpy and hard to care for. I think Jacob was a little bit whiny about getting older. He might have used it as leverage, like, oh, this will be the last Christmas I'm around. You all better do what I want you to do. Anybody ever use that as leverage in your family? Anybody have any grandparents or anybody like it? This will be the last, you better. You know, Joseph, he still loved his dad. He had patience with him. He cared for him. He visited him. And if he were in a nursing home, if he were in a retirement home, he would have been there for him. And it's so sad to go into nursing homes today, isn't it? It's so sad to see these people who are put away, forgotten, just pushed to the edge of society, waiting to die. There are so many nursing homes around here too. That what a great ministry. Are we too busy to? Are we just too busy to go to a nursing home and say, "Hey, I don't know you," but they'll probably forget you were there. But for that moment, to show them some love. Well, it's a great place of ministry. It's a great place of ministry. I know Steve Parsons does ministry at nursing homes, and he'd love to get you plugged into some around here. And some of you have relatives there. And I'm not saying you neglect them. I'm not saying you do that, but don't forget them. Don't forget them. And just be, because they're not going to be around forever. Joseph cared for his aging father. You know what else, though? He remained loyal to his family. There was a big cultural gap here. Now, for over 20 years, Joseph had lived in Egypt. He had really, in a lot of ways, become Egyptian. I'm sure he dressed the dress. We know he talked the language from the last chapter. We know he spoke Egyptian. And he had married an Egyptian woman. He had become, for all practical purposes, an Egyptian. Yet when these shepherd, dirty desert dwellers moved in, who were his brothers, his blood brothers, he was still loyal to them. He didn't turn his nose up at them. He didn't neglect them. He didn't turn his back on them. He loved them. Listen, Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I'm going to go up and speak to Pharaoh, and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household who are living in the land of Canaan have come to me. I'm going to tell them. The men are shepherds. They tend livestock, and they have brought along their flocks and herds and everything they own. But when Pharaoh, listen to this. Now, this is interesting. When Pharaoh calls you in and asks you, he says, what's your occupation? You should answer, your servants have tended livestock from our boyhood on, just as our fathers did. Then you'll be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen, for all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. In other words, what Joseph was saying here is, look, don't say you're shepherds, because Egyptians hate shepherds. You know, there's something about that nomadic desert, dirty life out there that these sophisticated, city-dwelling Egyptians you look down upon. So don't tell them you're shepherds, tell them you're farmers. Tell them you're tending livestock. Now, Joseph wasn't telling them to lie. Remember, he said, I'm going to tell Pharaoh that you're shepherds. But when you, in the presence of his court and all these people around him, I don't want you to embarrass Pharaoh. He has entrusted me to the kingdom. I don't want you to embarrass him by, telling him you're shepherds, and then everybody in his courtroom, giving that uncomfortable cough or looking down upon you now and looking bad on him because he's letting shepherds into the kingdom. So Joseph said, I'm going to go ahead and tell them, but you just say, this is what you do. And you know what happened in chapter 47? Joseph went and told Pharaoh, hey, my father and brothers with their flocks and herds of everything they own, they've come from the land of Canaan and are now in Goshen. And he chose 5 brothers and presented them before Pharaoh. Remember, he told him, he said, don't say you're shepherds. Don't tell him you're shepherds. He knows you're shepherds. You tell him you're tenders of livestock, because he's going to be in a public place. Pharaoh asked the brothers, what's your occupation? What do they say? Your servants are shepherds, just as our fathers were. Now, probably what happened here is they were in the presence of a what was considered a god. Pharaoh was considered God. Now, they did not acknowledge him as God. Joseph didn't acknowledge him as God, but he was a big deal. I mean, he was a big, important person. There was probably fanfare. This guy was probably in a golden throne. I mean, this was an impressive place, and these guys were out of the desert. Joseph cleaned them up, I'm sure, and he chose the 5 best, but I'm sure they were a little nervous. Have you ever stood in front of somebody and kind of got nervous? I mean, it was your time. It was your time to speak. It was your time to present your case, and they were some big shot, and they were waiting on you to present your case. Or maybe, guys, it was a girl, you know, when you were younger, and you knew what you wanted to say, and when you finally got the gumption or the words out, they were like all garbled up. They were all wrong because you were nervous. I'm sure they laughed about this later, but I think that's probably what happened. But Joseph remained loyal to his family. He took care of his family. You know, there's so many families today. Here's what I see. There's so many families today that when mom and dad get older or when mom and dad pass away, the families divide. You know why? Because they fight. They fight over stuff. They fight over property. And, you know, I like the old saying, do your giving while you're living. That way you're knowing where it's going. Really, might not be a bad idea if you think your kids are going to fight over your stuff when you're gone. Just give it to them before they leave, and let's all agree this is who it's going to. I don't know. I don't know if that's the right way to do it. I know that people have gotten mad about that too, but boy, it takes a strong family to stay together when mom and dad pass away. But it all depends on how mom and dad pass away. This must have been Joseph's greatest moment in his career. I think if you could have asked Joseph, what was the greatest moment in your career? I think he would have said, you know, when my dad stood in front of Pharaoh, that was my greatest moment. And he moved his whole family in. There are a lot of people who have great moments in their life when they work for 20 years and finally get an opportunity to stand in front of the boss or stand in front of an audience, or, you know, they work their whole career for this. Or maybe, you know, this is not what they thought it was going to be, but it was this that they look back on and say, you know what, of all the accomplishments I had, this was my greatest moment. It's when my child stood up and said, I love Jesus. Wow, what a great moment. You think you've been living for accomplishments and for awards and for trophies and for certificates on the wall, but when you can see that my greatest moment is when my kid says, no to drugs, and yes to Jesus. That's your greatest moment. I think Joseph was proud. You should read the story some more. I'm not going to cover it all, but you know, Jacob ends up blessing Pharaoh and complains to him about being old. It's kind of funny how much he complained about being old. Now, the Israelites settled in Egypt in the region of Goshen. They acquired property there and were fruitful and increased greatly in number. Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years, and the years of his life were 147. When the time drew near for him to die, he called for his son Joseph and said to him, if I found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh and promise that you will show me kindness and faithfulness and do not bury me in Egypt. That was a way, kind of a way of making a promise or an oath. But when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried. I will do as you say, Joseph said. Swear to me, Jacob said. Then Joseph swore to him, and Israel worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. Now, you should read sometime this funeral procession, this Egyptian, they had, you know, Jacob was embalmed, and they had this great funeral procession, this Egyptian. It would have cost a lot of money, a lot of organization, that went up to Canaan, and the Canaanites said, wow, the Egyptians are having a funeral. So, he cared for his father. He remained loyal to his family. Sometime later, Joseph was told, your father's ill. He's getting ready to die. So he took his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, along with him. And when Jacob was told, your son Joseph has come to you, he rallied his strength and sat up on the bed. Here's this old man. His son, his favorite son, is coming, and he gets the strength up to bless him one last time. And he's going to offer this blessing on Joseph. Gary Smalley and John Trent wrote a book called The Blessing. If you're a grandparent or a parent of adult children, you should read this book. They talk about it in this book how parents and grandparents should bless their children and grandchildren. They should offer a blessing on them. You know why? Because, and I know this, I'm getting older, and many of you are too. Listen to this. This is This is something you need to realize if you're a parent. Your children, and you as a child, never stop seeking your approval. They never do. We never stop seeking approval of our parents. I'm 48 years old, and I still have this desire to hear my dad say or my mother say, "I'm so proud of you. That was so good." That's why it's so hard to lose your parents. That's why it's so hard to say goodbye in death to a parent, because it's an end of an era in your life. And it's that person that affirms you. It's that person that gives you worth when nobody else does. And that's what parents do. They're gone. And there's nobody there to do that anymore. That's why it's so hard to lose a mom or a dad. It's not because you don't know they're going to die, especially when they're older or they're sick or they get some terrible disease, but it's because it's the end of an era when this person who was my affirmation could give that to me. They're gone. And so there's a lot of grief. So when Jacob saw the sons of Joseph, because Joseph brought Ephraim and Manasseh, he said, "Who are these?" And Joseph said, "They're the sons God has given me here." Evidently, maybe the first time Jacob had met his grandsons. Joseph said to his father, "Then Israel said, 'Bring them to me so I may bless them.'" So this is where Ephraim and Manasseh got the blessing, and they got the portion in the land. If you remember your Old Testament history, you know the 12 tribes of Israel, they're kind of, they're represented there, but there are 12 tribes, but Joseph's sons both got a blessing and an inheritance in the promised land. Now, how could that happen if there were 12 and his sons got 2? Well, you remember that Levi's children did not get an inheritance in the land. They were the priests. They had a portion in every land. So you take away Joseph and you take away Levi and you add Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph got a double portion. Ephraim and Manasseh got each a portion. So that's why you have them in the listing of the 12. So, that's the important thing. Joseph passed down his spiritual heritage. That's important. Listen, I want to tell you something, folks. Godly children doesn't happen by accident. Your kids are not going to say no to drugs and premarital sex, and they're not going to say no to bad behavior and to that lifestyle you don't want them to. They're not going to do that accidentally. They're going to do that because that's what you've put into them. And sometimes I have to say, that you can put into them, and they still will go that way. And some things we can't explain, and we don't know why. But listen, if you're going to gracefully age, this is one of the things should be your goal, to pass down your spiritual heritage. Give them maybe what you didn't have when you were young. It's not going to happen accidentally. You got to work at it. You got to talk about it. I can remember when I was a little kid, my dad didn't go to church a whole lot. He was raised in church, but he kind of went wayward for a little while. And then when he went back to church, he went with his mother, my grandmother, and he didn't go with us in our family at our church. He kind of felt beholden to her, I guess, but that was okay. Except that caused problems too, because we were in two different churches that kind of had different styles and things. But nonetheless, he was going, and that was important. But I can remember being a little bitty boy. And I never, ever remember my daddy saying a prayer at the dinner table. And somehow that was important to me. He wasn't bad. I can remember bad language when I was a little kid and cursing and things like that. But I remember when I was in probably young high school, I still remember it like it was yesterday, the first time when I heard my dad say the prayer over dinner. It made a mark on me like nothing else he ever did in my life. And that was important to me. Not that I wouldn't have turned out the way I am. My mother's father, my grandfather, big influence in my life. But I want to tell you something. When my dad took spiritual responsibility for our family when I was in high school, it made a difference in my life. I don't know where you dads are. I don't know if you're passing this on to mom. I don't know if you're hoping the church will do this job for you. But if you'll step forward and you'll take responsibility to passing the spiritual baton of faith to your children, it could make all the difference in their lives. It'll make it easier for Ryan, our student minister, for Candy, our children's minister. Because what we do here is only supplemental to what you're doing at home, because you've got them a lot longer than we do. Look, you got to do this. Deuteronomy 6 says when they get up, when they lie down, when they walk along the road, when they're sitting at breakfast, when they're eating dinner, whenever it is, this has got to be a part of who you are as a family. It's not easy. It's hard work, but it's some of the most rewarding work you'll ever have. To be able to see your children become adults, young adults, and be faithful to God and faithful in the church. I want to tell you, I count my blessings every day. I stand up here in front of you and I put a lot of pressure on my kids. High expectations. High expectations. But I want to tell you something. I don't think they're too high. It's only what God expects. And who knows? You know, there have been a lot of preachers' kids who were the worst kids in the neighborhood. They were the worst of the worst. And I just thank my God every day that they were more like their mother than me when they were younger. Amen. So, and I wasn't a bad kid, but I had bad moments. This verse says, I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth. No greater joy. I promise you, if you'll pass your spiritual heritage down to your kids when they're young, because see, here's what a lot of parents do. They'll start when the kids are young, and then somewhere where the kids get upper elementary school and middle school, they drop the ball there. They want to be friends now. We just want to be friends. We don't want to be parents anymore. We want to be friends. And you can do whatever you want to do as long as you still like me. I'm your parent, but I want you to like me. If you can still be my friend. And when they're in high school, then they get exposed to all the garbage in our public high schools today, and they get pulled away. And before you know it, they drop out of church. And I want to tell you, it's a lot of hard work. Maybe you dropped the ball there already. If you did, listen, you don't have to say it's over for me. What you need to do is you need to stand up and you need to say, look, I'm changing my ways. I want to be involved in your life in a spiritual way. Before I die, I want to know that you have maybe what I didn't give you before, but I'm going to give it to you now. And I promise you, when your children walk in the truth, you'll have joy and you'll have peace and you may even sleep better. I don't know. So, this is something that Joseph did. When Jacob had finished giving instruction to his sons, he drew his feet up into his bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. That kind of reminds me of Forrest Gump, I'm tired, I'm going to quit running now. Jacob, chapter 49 is all about Jacob blessing all his sons. He blessed them all, chapter 49, and then he died. Joseph threw himself on his father, and he wept over him and kissed him. Then Joseph directed the physicians in his service to embalm his father, so the physicians embalmed him. This was an Egyptian thing, taking a full 40 days, for that was the time required for embalming, and the Egyptians mourned for him 70 days. He was old, he grieved, and that the Bible says there's a time to laugh, and there's a time to cry, there's a time to dance, there's a time to grieve. So, but we don't grieve like those who don't have hope, do we? Paul says, look, brothers and sisters, we don't want you to be uninformed about those who sleep in death so that you don't grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. We have our funerals. Those are times of closure, and they're great times. They pull people together. They pull families back together. But we don't cry and grieve like we'll never see them again. That's what the point is with Christians and non-Christians. Paul said, to me to live is Christ. We celebrate our loved ones' gain. So Genesis closes, chapter 50, with three big events. Jacob has this funeral procession. Joseph gives him this funeral procession up to Canaan, the land of Canaan. And then the second big event is, I mentioned this last week, when Jacob died, Joseph's brothers came around and said, uh-oh, he's going to get back at us now. Dad's gone. You know, a lot of things happen when the parents die, and then we start fighting now because they're gone. Nobody here to hold us accountable. Nobody here to keep us unified. But that's not the right way. And that's when Joseph uttered, I think, one of the greatest lines of this story. He said, you meant this for evil, but God meant this for good. He saw the big picture. He said, I was sent ahead of you to preserve this line, to preserve people. And so that happened, and then finally Joseph died at the age of 110. Let's read it. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years old and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. Also the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What a prophetic word there. And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they had embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. And that's how the book ends. You know the last thing? Joseph always remembered who he was. He had been in Egypt most of his life. He was in Egypt a lot longer than he was ever in the house of his father, but he remembered who he was. It would have been so easy for Joseph to say, you know what, I'm Egyptian now. Just leave me here in this tomb with King Tut or somebody. And you know what would have been easier too? I'm impressed that his sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, who had an Egyptian mother, that they didn't say, oh no, gosh, I don't want that lifestyle. But they stayed in touch, and 400 years later, when the new Pharaoh said, these people are too numerous, let's make them slaves, Ephraim and Manasseh's descendants were in there, although they had an Egyptian mother. What an incredible spiritual heritage we have here in remembering that, look, I don't belong here. This isn't my home. I don't belong in Egypt. I belong with God's people. There's only one mention of Joseph. This is incredible. There's countless mentions of lots of Old Testament people in the New Testament. Only one of Joseph. And it's in Hebrews chapter 11 in the Hall of Faith. And it's about this moment, this last moment when Joseph says, hey, God's going to deliver you. And don't forget to take my bones with you when you leave, because don't leave me here. It's like your mother saying, I don't want to be buried there. Or, her last words, do not let so-and-so fix my hair when, I've heard that kind of thing happen. These are his last words, look, I don't belong here. I belong with God's people. You know, I suspect that many of you are living in Egypt, and you're comfortable here. You're comfortable here because there's luxury here, there's wealth here, there's comfort here. But I want to tell you, you don't belong here. And if you could remember that as you get older, if you can remember that you're just passing through, and listen, I'm going to bless you as I leave, and I want you to bless them as they leave. We're all going to meet over there. We're all going to meet over there one day. Listen, you don't have to get old in a bad way. And there's so many great people in this church who are aging gracefully. And I applaud you. You have aches and pains that you probably never thought you were going to have. But I just applaud you for aging gracefully. We're all going to be there if the Lord tarries. And I just want to reinforce that we're going to meet over there one day. Let's meet over there one day. Stand up with me. I want to pray for you. I want to pray that wherever you are, if you have parents who are aging, if your parents are gone and now you're the grandparents, or maybe you're so young this whole sermon seems silly to you, I just want you to hold on, because we're all headed that way. In a sense, as Billy Graham wrote that book, we're all nearing home, aren't we? We're all nearing home. Lord, I pray that we would near home with grace, with faith, with trust. I pray, God, that you would help us to be a blessing as we get older. A blessing, not a curse. I pray, God, that you would help us to be of the nature where people like to be around us. They don't try to avoid us. I pray, God, that you would help us to be the biggest encouragers and supporters to young Christians, young preachers and ministers and elders and deacons, children. I pray, God, that you would help us to age with the end in sight. And God, tomorrow could be the day for any of us. Our days are numbered. I pray that you would help us, that you would be our guide and our strength through every single one of our days. This is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. No matter your age this morning, I invite you to come if you've never accepted Christ as your Savior. If you've never obeyed Him in baptism, if you've never proclaimed that you want to put roots down, that you want to really be accountable, I just invite you to come this morning as we sing this song.